They didn't even have the decency to make it awkward. No farewell lunch, no handshake from HR. Not even one of those forced office-wide emails that say, "We wish them the best on their next journey." Nothing. Just a 9:07 a.m. Teams call from someone I'd trained 6 months ago. She stumbled through a script she clearly hadn't written, then told me my position was being dissolved to restructure for agility. Her camera was off. Mine wasn't. I glanced behind her words, trying to spot the real reason. Budget cuts? Politics? Or maybe just convenience? None of it mattered anymore. When I returned to my office, or what used to be mine, a 20-something intern was already settling in. Same monitor, same chair. Still had my calendar reminders showing up on the screen. I didn't say a word. Just nodded, took my mug, and walked out. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I did smile. The kind you give when you realize you've just been underestimated for the last time. My name's Eric Mason. I'm 46 years old. And until 3 weeks ago, I was the longest-serving employee at ArcBridge Solutions. I joined when the company was just an idea scribbled on a whiteboard in a dusty loft downtown. 6 employees, no funding, no structure, just potential, and a lot of chaos. Back then, titles didn't matter. I wasn't director of operations. Yet, I was just the guy who stayed late when printers jammed, who organized files when no one else knew how to sort them. I didn't have an MBA or fancy connections. What I had was a willingness to show up, consistently, quietly, without excuses. Over the years, I built their backbone. The workflows, the escalation ladders, the cross-team alignment structures, all of it. I trained the first project manager, and then his replacement, and hers after that. 3 entire cycles of turnover, and I was still the one they called at 11 p.m. when servers froze or a client panicked. I never missed a deadline. Not once. Didn't take a single sick day for the first 5 years. I knew every team lead by name, remembered who preferred Slack over email, who needed hand-holding, and who needed space. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept the company breathing. And I didn't ask for applause. I didn't expect recognition. I believed in something old-fashioned, that if you did good work, the right people would notice. That loyalty still had weight in the real world. Maybe I was wrong. I was there for every team birthday, brought coffee to interns when they showed. Up early and anxious. Gave up weekends to prep client decks nobody else wanted to touch. I believed I was part of something, not just building a company, but growing a culture. Looking back, I don't know if that was purpose or just misplaced faith, because the truth is, I thought being indispensable meant I was safe. Turns out, I just made myself easier to overlook. The signs were subtle at first. Fewer check-ins from leadership. Fewer CCS on key updates. My name started disappearing from agendas where I'd once been the first bullet point. At first, I chalked it up to bandwidth. We were expanding. Meetings were tighter. But then they stopped asking for my input altogether. The language changed too. What I once called risk forecasting, they started calling resistance. My suggestions were labeled legacy thinking. And whenever I pointed to past data or warned of repeat mistakes, they'd smile politely and say, "We're moving in a more agile direction." Then came Derek. Fresh from a mid-tier business school and still quoting his professors like scripture. He had that polished startup pitch energy, all enthusiasm, no depth, slides full of buzzwords, charts with no grounding in our actual systems. He spoke with the certainty of someone who hadn't lived through a single failed rollout. They told me he'd be shadowing me for a month. Learning from the best, they said. Absorb how operations really work. I took it seriously. I gave him access to my files, walked him through my systems, even showed him the logic behind our workflow automations, the the same ones I'd spent 6 years perfecting. 2 weeks later, he was presenting my structure in a meeting I wasn't invited to. Same charts, same naming conventions, same end-to-end flow. No attribution, no mention of where it came from. Just him, standing at the whiteboard like he'd built it from scratch. I kept quiet. At that point, I still believed someone would notice. That leadership would remember where that system came from. That someone would speak up. No one did. The following Monday, HR called me in. They used the word redundant. Said the org chart had changed. Said Derek would be leading a new initiative aligned with our evolving priorities. The same initiative I had designed. They thanked me for my service. Asked if I'd be willing to support the transition by mentoring Derek for a few weeks. I didn't respond. Not with words. I just stood up, adjusted my sleeves, and handed over my badge. I didn't take the box they offered. I didn't clean out my drawer. Everything I needed was already in my head, and everything they were stealing, they didn't understand enough to protect. On the way out, I passed Derek in the hallway. He looked up from his phone, gave a small nod, like we were peers now. Like I hadn't just been erased in front of him. That's when it hit me. They weren't building on what I made. They were repackaging it with a newer face and pretending it had never existed before. All the years, the sacrifice, the late nights, they'd been converted into a bullet point on Derek's resume. And maybe, in a way, I saw it coming. The trust had been thinning for months. The culture had shifted. Loyalty had become a liability. And experience? Just another thing they couldn't measure on a KPI dashboard. Still, walking out that day. It hurt. Not because I lost a job, but because I realized I'd spent 18 years building something that could be wiped away with a smile and a buzzword. People expected me to snap. Friends called, half whispering through the line like they were speaking to a man just released from prison. They offered condolences, drinks, advice. Some even offered me job leads, quietly, as if I'd been shamed. They thought I'd be furious, wounded, eager to lash out. But I wasn't. I was calm. Not numb, alert. The truth is, I didn't leave that building empty-handed. While they kept the chair and the title, I walked out with something they never bothered to track. Knowledge. Real knowledge. Not data points or org charts, but the living blueprint of how the company functioned and where it was weakest. I had built more than workflows. I'd rewritten contracts behind closed doors when the legal team panicked last minute. I had diffused client escalations that never made it into reports. I had authorized silent exceptions to save quarterly targets, and I kept no trail. There were favors, handshake understandings, shortcuts buried inside temporary workarounds. That became permanent. All of it lived in my head. So I didn't rage. I reviewed. For the next 7 days, I kept to myself. Didn't post anything online. Didn't return most calls. I just observed, the way you do when a structure is being tested for stress. I watched what they tried to change. The public announcements. The LinkedIn posts. The internal promotions. They celebrated like trophies. But more interesting was what they missed. The undocumented dependencies. The stopgaps I had warned would break without maintenance. The permissions I granted verbally that no one else even knew were restricted. They started tripping, slowly, subtly. Projects delayed. Client questions surfaced. Internal tools froze. During month-end reporting, and I just took notes. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about precision. The kind you only earn when you've built something piece by piece and watched every corner take shape. I wasn't looking to tear anything down. Not out of spite. I just wanted to see what happened when the foundation realized the architect had quietly walked away and taken the blueprint with him. Arc Bridge had always prided itself on being agile. But agility, in our case, meant shortcuts. The kind you don't talk about in quarterly reports. We moved fast by stepping around process, not through it. And I was the one who kept those shortcuts from collapsing under their own weight. 18 years meant I'd seen every fire. Solved most of them. But I also made it a point, quietly, to document everything the surface-level audits missed. Off-the-record backdoors. Manual overrides built into automation scripts. Vendor extensions granted without signatures, with notes I left for myself in encrypted folders. After I left, no one thought to deactivate my access to the internal systems tied to my personal network. I didn't touch anything, didn't download a single file, but I watched from a distance. And what I saw confirmed what I already suspected. They weren't maintaining the system. They were imitating it. The first red flag came on day 3. I received a late-night call from Anna, a former junior PM I'd mentored for 5 years. She had been looped into a client escalation involving a large vendor renewal. "Eric," she said, her voice tight, "did you ever archive the original Casanto contract from 2021? Legal's saying we missed the automatic renewal clause. There, pushing a 17% rate hike retroactively. I had the PDF. Of course I did. I didn't send it. Not yet. I just asked a few quiet questions. Dates, chain of custody, who had handled the renewal cycle since my departure. Derek's name came up. Naturally, by day 5, I started pulling my own audit logs. I still had read-only access to a series of old email archives I'd stored locally. Nothing sensitive, nothing proprietary, but enough to reconstruct a full timeline of key decisions I'd handled personally. 4 vendor contracts, all critical to compliance and uptime. All quietly expired within 2 weeks of my departure. Each one required proactive renewal, something I used to do manually. No auto reminders, no shared team calendars. Just me and a handwritten note stuck to the back of my monitor. They hadn't renewed any of them, and that wasn't the worst of it. Derek had gone ahead and rebranded my operational framework, the one I'd spent 3 years perfecting. He'd slapped a new name on it, rearranged a few headers, and presented it internally as a scalable innovation. But the bones were mine. Same language, same tiered escalation logic. I even spotted a formatting error I remembered intentionally, leaving in a legacy draft just to test QA attentiveness. But he hadn't just copied it. He'd misunderstood it. He filed sensitive client data under Tier 3 storage, which meant it bypassed our standard encryption rules. I cross-checked with our compliance matrix. That error alone placed the company in breach of 3 international data handling regulations. 1 audit, and half our enterprise accounts would walk. I knew this wasn't sabotage. It was worse. It was incompetence parading as innovation. I reached out to one more person, Raj, our former DevOps lead. He had resigned last year after burning out on midnight escalations. But we'd remained in touch, trusted each other. When I told him what I'd found, he didn't question it. Just said, "You want logs?" I kept a copy of the old audit trails, full stack. In case the new kids burned it all down. He emailed them that night, encrypted. Password sent over text. Within hours. I had complete visibility, not just the missed contracts and the compliance breach, but the internal timestamp data that proved Derek's edits had been made post-transition, after my termination. And the kicker? He had included my original folder tags in the metadata. He hadn't even removed my initials from the backend notes. They weren't just stealing my work. They were doing it badly. And suddenly, everything was clear. This wasn't just about a company moving on. It was about a group of people who thought they could rebuild a house by tearing out its foundation, forgetting who'd laid the concrete. They didn't know how deep the wiring went, how many systems depended on invisible glue. They had replaced the glue with duct tape. And now, all I had to do was wait. I didn't shout, didn't rant on LinkedIn, didn't leak anything to the press. That kind of noise feels good in the moment, but it rarely moves the needle. And it wasn't after noise. I was after clarity.2 emails. That's all it took. The first went to the Industry Compliance Board, addressed directly to the audit division I used to liaise with quarterly. No dramatic language. No accusations, just documents, screenshots, version history metadata, contract, PDFs with expiration highlights. I included timestamps, file names, a list of compliance flags that would be automatically triggered under standard policy review. I didn't editorialize. I didn't suggest they take action. I simply gave them a flashlight and pointed it at the cracks. The second email went to the CEO. Same structure. No tone, just information. A quiet reminder that breach disclosures aren't optional and that falsified framework authorship, when paired with improperly stored client data, isn't something investors tend to view kindly. I signed it with my full name, not out of pride, but out of precision. Then I logged off. No follow-ups, no passive-aggressive tweets, no feeding the fire, because the work was already done. What no one at ArcBridge realized or bothered to learn was that I'd renegotiated my contract 3 years prior. It was after a major expansion cycle when they needed me to take on more strategic risk without the title bump to match. I'd asked for something small on paper, a legal carve-out, a non-compete waiver that allowed me to exit and consult externally under certain conditions, provided there was no active litigation and the company was at or above a specific valuation threshold. They gave it to me. No one asked questions. They were in a hurry to close dots, so while they thought they'd closed the door behind me, they never realized I still had the key, and I wasn't coming back to knock. I was already across the street. 3 days after the emails, I accepted an offer from their largest competitor, a mid-sized firm with aging systems, but a hunger to scale. They didn't hire me for revenge. They brought me in for architecture. They wanted the kind of system you build when you've seen what shortcuts can do. And this time, I wasn't starting from scratch. I wasn't interested in dragging ArcBridge's name through the mud. That would have been easy. But easy doesn't rebuild anything. I wanted to work somewhere that still believed infrastructure mattered. Somewhere that wouldn't gut the foundation just to hang new signage. Besides, truth doesn't need volume. It just needs exposure, and I had already shown them where the light should be pointed. It was the 3rd Tuesday of the month, September 12th, 10 a.m., ArcBridge's Q3 forecast meeting. Derek stood at the front of the executive conference room, sleeves rolled, voice slick with enthusiasm. A glass wall behind him framed the skyline. His slides had gradients, animations, buzzwords stacked on top of buzzwords. Velocity, modernization, streamlined expansion. He was 5 minutes in when the screen froze. At first, it looked like a tech hiccup. He clicked. Nothing. A few nervous chuckles around the table. Then the compliance alert appeared in the top right corner of the shared monitor. Red flag. Unauthorized framework modification. Tier 3 data misclassification. The room shifted. He stared at the message, not quite processing it. The VP of Legal stood up, quietly. So did 2 board members who had joined remotely from New York and Berlin. The chat feed in the call began to fill with messages. One of them pasted a quote from my email. Time-stamped, annotated, precise. Derek turned pale. The kind of pale that doesn't come from embarrassment, but recognition. I wasn't in the room. Didn't need to be. My name wasn't even mentioned aloud. But every person seated there knew where that alert came from, and what it meant, and why they'd failed to catch it before this moment. Anna messaged me an hour later. Legal brought in an external investigator. Derek's access has been suspended. They're combing through version histories. Quiet chaos. I thanked her and turned off my phone. I was in a different boardroom by then. Smaller, warmer, quieter. The kind that smells like wood polish and espresso. Not panicked. We were onboarding our third ArcBridge client that week. Not one of them asked why I left. They didn't need to. They'd been on the other end of Derek's errors. Missed files, unanswered queries, shuffled teams. Their confidence had already cracked. My presence was the sealant they'd been waiting for. They followed me, not out of spite, but because they trusted the system I built, not the new face assigned to maintain it. 2 more came the following week. These weren't just contracts. These were relationships. Ones I had spent years building, sometimes across airports, and 3 amen conference calls, sometimes over quiet conversations in break rooms after a crisis had been contained. You don't forget the person who picks up the phone when everyone else has gone silent. Back at ArcBridge, things move fast. I later learned the board launched an internal audit, not just into Derek's actions, but into the leadership culture that allowed them to go unchecked. A few strategic resignations followed. Titles changed. Faces disappeared from the website, but I never said anything publicly. No press release, no passive-aggressive tweets, no anonymous interviews, because truth, when well documented, doesn't need commentary. It just needs a clean chain of custody. That's what I left behind. A blueprint, a pattern, a signature only I knew how to read. They thought they were erasing me by replacing me. All they did was confirm I was the architect. And Derek? Last I heard, he's exploring new opportunities, which is a polite way of saying he fell through the floor he didn't know had a crack in it. There's a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when someone realizes they're standing on borrowed ground, that everything they've built is held together by someone else's invisible labor. And that moment came for him, in the form of a pop-up alert mid-presentation with the entire board watching. I never raised my voice, never slammed the door, never even corrected the record. I just made sure the record was complete and let it speak for itself. It's been 7 months. The transition wasn't loud. No press headlines, no vanity updates, just quiet systems, rebuilt properly. The firm I joined didn't want showmanship. They wanted structure. So that's what I gave them. No shortcuts. No inflated KPIs. Just the kind of foundational design that holds under pressure, even when no one's looking. We're more efficient now than ArcBridge ever was at its peak. Internal escalations dropped by 42%. Onboarding time? Cut in half. I rebuilt the framework for memory, refined it, actually. Removed the patches I used to rely on. Replaced them with real scalability. Clean architecture, no ego. No one in. My new office talks about titles. There are no performance theater presentations. Just work, and a kind of mutual respect. You don't have to schedule into a quarterly review. Derek's name hasn't appeared on ArcBridge's site since Q4. No announcement. No farewell message. Just a quiet deletion from the Our Leaders page, the digital equivalent of a shrug. I didn't check often, but when I did, the signs were clear. His LinkedIn went private. His endorsements disappeared. His buzzwords found their way into job listings written by someone else. As for the CEO, resigned for family reasons. That's the line they went with. The thing about corporate statements is that the quieter they sound, the louder the truth usually is. But this was never about watching them fall. I didn't do any of this for revenge. I did it because clarity matters. Because when you've spent nearly 2 decades building something from the inside, you want to know if it meant anything, and what happens to the structure when you walk away. Now, I know, they mistook silence for weakness, mistook tenure for obsolescence, mistook calm for complacency. But loyalty isn't measured by how long you stay. It's how you leave, what you protect, what you walk away from without setting it on fire. I never needed them to regret losing me. I just needed them to realize what they lost. These days, I don't show up to offices with my name on a plaque. I don't need recognition. I build systems. And once they work, I leave. That's the legacy. Quiet, solid, undeniable. The people who mattered saw it. The ones who didn't, they were never really looking. Let them replace you. Just make sure they notice what happens when you're gone.